All right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Unapologetic Apologists, where we learn to be sophisticated in our thinking about Christian philosophy. Super excited to have my next guest. We met a couple days ago, and we were just talking. He wanted to do an interview, so we're gonna try to help his YouTube channel grow. But first, let's introduce him, Dylan Johnson. Thank you for being here, sir.
Oh, glad to be on here.
Yeah, so got several questions written down, and they were fed to me, but it's okay. It's okay. Um, So just since we haven't met before and we kind of don't have really chemistry, we're gonna to kind of make sure we have some things to talk about. But maybe first, the first question I typically ask people is their personal testimony, how they came to faith, whether that's kind of a raised thing, learned later, whether, and then how apologetics got incorporated into it, if not from the start.
So, in middle school, I was sort of an agnostic. Should I say I was like mad at God? I had, should I say, unexplained anger or rage towards Him. And so, what kind of started to change was in high school. I had doubts like I had never had before. It was like doubts such as, does God actually exist? And these doubts were troubling to me. And so that's what really got me into apologetics, was just looking up answers. And specifically, the one apologist who I got into that I really liked for a time was Kent Hovind, and also Ken Ham. But there's also Billy Crone too. They're all, young Earth creationists, anti-evolutionists, and I thought they were really smart, really confident, and so I'd watch their videos. I watched Kent Hovind endlessly, and then I that's when I got into should I say I started to go down a wrong path, and at church camp was when it kind of changed. I had felt, should I say, con- um I forgot the term. It was like the Holy Spirit had like informed me of my sins, and
Conviction.
I was convicted. Yeah, convicted. And so I'd felt bad, and so that's when I repented, and that's when I really felt God just kind of surround me. And later that day, He called me into the ministry, in which I had no desire to be into the ministry. I was At that time I was into cars, but yeah, the He called me into ministry, and so I started. That's when I started watching IP. I found his channel, and that really changed a lot, because he's honest about everything, and so that's what really made me love his channel. And so now I'm currently um working on getting into, well, I've been accepted into Southern Nazarene in Bethany, Oklahoma. That way I can take pastoral ministry to be a youth pastor or pastor. I'm not sure of one of the two.
Right on. Well, that's cool. So two follow up questions to there. What did you want to do with cars?
I wanted to do collision repair. So I had in here in Enid, Oklahoma, we have a school called Autry Technology Center, and when I was sophomore, we were taking tours of Autry, and the one class that really stood out to me was collision repair, and I just liked it so much. The painting, the welding, and so I wanted to sign up for it. I thought it was better than welding or the automotive class, and so I was just really psyched to start taking collision repair until my calling and at church camp just kind of changed it all.
Yeah.
It was like well, I guess I'll still take collision repair as kind of a side activity.
Yeah, I mean, because you could technically still do it, because ministry is great and all, but we also gotta be able to keep the lights on.
Yeah, got to keep the lights on.
Yeah,
Yep.
but you mentioned starting off in Kent Hovind and now IP being one of your more favorite guys. I I have to ask the question: what did you think of the debate between the two?
Oh, it was great. At the time, I was still kind of before I had eventually given up on my anti-evolutionist views and came to accept them. I think I was more towards IP, but at the same time, I still had some sympathy for Kent Hovind. But then after I watched the debate a couple of times, you know, it kind of stood out to me that Kent really didn't have a solid argument. It was more emotional verbiage rather than like facts that show like, hey, you know, evolution can't really cohere with scripture because IP got me into John Walton. I read his book, Lost World of Genesis 1. I really liked it because it was a kind of a better way of understanding the first chapter of Genesis, because I think if we understand it as a functional rather than a material, then it really does kind of clear up the whole debate about Genesis. Like we can stay open as to how God did it, and I think that right there is kind of a good. I think at the end of his book, when he said this kind of really clears up the whole debate and what we should be teaching in the classroom, it really made sense why this should be more functional understanding than material understanding.
Yeah.
But watching the debate between Kent Hovind and IP, it was Kent Hovind kind of got slaughtered.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I won't necessarily dog him because I've had him on. I've had both of them on the channel. So I have respect for both of them. Obviously I disagree with both of them on some stuff. I disagree with Kent more than I would with IP. I'm on board if we're talking Old Earth. I'm not quite so on board if we're talking evolution. So maybe we could get into that later, although we don't have to. But I guess to kind of just like maybe open it up to an argument you'd like to discuss. Like, what would be your favorite argument in apologetics?
Okay, so my favorite argument in apologetics, so all of the arguments were really good, but like I felt as if, man, I felt as there was like something missing. So I got into the argument of the resurrection and stuff, and that really strengthened my faith because, if the resurrection is true, then that shows that, Jesus was who he claimed to be. He claimed to be divine, and so that shows that, hey, God, could have raised him from the dead. And that's what really kind of, I guess you could classify it into miracles, like major miracles. And that's what really kind of strengthened my faith, was just the argument for the resurrection.
Now, would you say, because some apologists differ on this, would you say that, taking that argument by itself, you would have to kind of couple with it evidence that miracles are even possible in the first place, or would you say that the argument itself is evidence for a miracle?
So when you look at the quality of the resurrection, and even Anthony Flew admits that, the resurrection is the best attested miracle of all time, which I would agree with him. I think just the overall quality of the miracle itself it's just really strong, and that kind of shows that I think we can be really confident that, he really did rise from the dead, because really like Bart Ehrman's biggest objection is that, well, miracles are so highly improbable. But, is that, like, I hear this argument a lot that, well, we know that people don't walk on water. We know that people can't fly. It's like, well, how do you know? I mean, like, if God exists, then yeah, he could do these things. And when you look at the quality of the resurrection, it's just much different from other miracles that have been proposed by other religions such as Islam or.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'd say, me personally, I take more of a worldview approach to it. I mean, I would think, like, if I were an atheist coming in, I would like just to study the evidence for the resurrection. I don't know that taken in isolation I would be convinced. For me, it is more of a kind of a worldview thing of, the religious culture that they were kind of entrenched in, and kind of other things that kind of the norm was to be religious, and then kind of this building through the Old Testament of history. And then, other arguments I think do help. But one thing did occur to me, as you're saying, that just kind of, I'm always playing devil's advocate in my brain. What would you say if, like, the atheist says, well, miracles, those are violations of the laws of nature, so shouldn't we trust the regular? Because you mentioned, well, we know people don't walk on water, don't rise from the dead. Well, sure, maybe we don't know it in the sense that there couldn't be an exception, but why shouldn't we trust the norm rather than the supposed violations of the laws of nature?
So how I see miracles is that natural laws cannot produce them in of themselves. Like, Jesus couldn't have naturally rose from the dead. If a natural law produced a miracle, now that would be impossible because natural laws are only what happens, on a regular basis, as a pattern. But I think idealism does a good job at explaining miracles, and that I've been getting into idealism. Specifically, there's a page on IP's website of recommended readings, and I'm just going to go down that whole list, and read all those books. But if you have a divine agent that can interact with the world, that who also created the world, then he's in ultimate control. He can what to do at any certain time, any given time, and I think that rather that a miracle is a violation of a natural law. I mean, technically, if you think about it, I mean, we're violating natural laws every day. When we pick up something, we're violating the law of gravity. But I think that a miracle is just something that natural laws can't produce themselves.
Right on. So yeah, actually, I had a couple follow-up questions, but real quick before we go further, do you have a YouTube channel you wanted to mention here?
Yes, I do. It's called Teaching Theology.
Teaching theology.
So my the my favorite subject is theology because I like studying God, and I think it's important for I think it's definitely important to kind of clear up any misconceptions on who God could be. Like when we study ancient culture, we really get a different picture of God than when we would try to interpret the Bible with a Western, like with a modern understanding. And when we use that modern understanding, we don't get an accurate picture of God because people in the ancient Near East, they didn't think that way necessarily. When God spoke to the prophets or he spoke to the psalmists, he spoke in a way that they could understand it, and that they could pass it on to the civilizations in that era, and that they could understand it too. But now that societies have just continuously evolved, it kind of has been a distortion. I think Michael Kona made a good point on this. When it comes to what Jesus meant as if he was coming back, whenever he has a clip on this on YouTube, but at first it didn't make sense, but now it's rather it kind of makes sense when you look at context, because when we read the Bible, it's like we're kind of getting an image of what that culture was like back then, but we can't really fully comprehend it, especially in our culture. That's why it's important to look at context. And when we look at the second coming of Jesus, there's multiple views on what that would be like. But I think it's definitely good to look at what the context is. And I think N.T. Wright has a really good argument as to what the end times are going to be like. It's just looking at the culture and what other surrounding cultures may have thought of these beliefs. I haven't gotten too much into the end times yet, but I think starting off with cultural context is the best way to go.
Yeah. So guys, go subscribe. It's Teaching Theology, and that's a great point. That's one thing I was talking about. Actually, I think it was a video I did for JMD's channel, not mine. But I was saying if you read some of the Old Testament laws, some of them can seem brutal, and you say, "Oh, so much for an inspired book. This is clearly a man-written book." But I think if you were actually living in that culture at that time, it would seem inspired, because all of the laws were vast improvements. They were vast moral improvements over the laws that they had at the time, and so that's a really important point about taking the cultural context into consideration.
Yeah, in fact, Tim Keller made a good point on this. I just read his book, The Reason for God, and I really enjoyed it. In some countries, forgiveness is considered wrong.
Yeah.
So to say that, God is evil because of the laws in the Old Testament, other countries may consider those Old Testament laws as good, while the picture of Jesus is just like unthinkable to them. So I think that kind of shows that, we should follow to a standard of morality rather, because like if you believe that morality is subjective and you try to say, well, God is evil because of what he's done in the Old Testament, or because of the Old Testament law, it's like, well, if you believe that morality is subjective, then it doesn't add up. I mean, you can't really justify that. I mean, it just doesn't really make sense. You can't really justify it
Right.
unless you have a standard of morality.
Yeah. And that's a point Stephen Crowder actually made, was that, atheists will say, well, you don't have to believe in God, and you can still be a moral person and do these things. And they're right. But of course, then you got to get taken into context the culture in which we live. And maybe that would be true for some of the more obvious things like murder or theft. You might be able to intuitively know that. But prior to modern Christendom, things like you said, mercy wasn't considered a virtue. Forgiveness wasn't considered a virtue. That was like unheard of, where the Bible says, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. These things weren't virtues until modern Christendom. So a lot of things you actually wouldn't necessarily know without the flying spaghetti monster telling you what they are. um,
Yeah.
so who is your favorite apologist? Is it Mike Jones, or no, is it somebody else?
Um, I'd have to say Mike Jones is. So first, I was really into like J. Warner Wallace. I'd classify him as my favorite, and he still is my favorite today. But yeah, Mike Jones is just something like he's just something really special. Like you can tell he's done just extensive studies on everything, like every topic, and I want to do the same. Like even just teaching theology, I still want to get into like process structuralism and idealism and just all these topics and just really become knowledgeable in these fields, because I think it's important. I think it is important as Christians that we dig into these fields and we really fully understand it. That way, whenever we're in an argument with somebody or we're trying to explain to somebody our worldview, give a more we can give a more understandable view, just a view that makes more sense to them. Because when we're telling them that, well, the Earth's 6,000 years old, we should reject evolution, somebody who's like in college taking biology, you know, they like maybe they're attracted by the church and they want to know more about who this Jesus guy is. We can't just start off with, well, you should reject evolution, you should accept that they're 6,000 years old. Yeah, we can't. We have to throw all that aside and we have to really study like what these guys actually believed back then. And that's going back to cultural context. It's like, we can't just say that, well, the Bible rejects evolution because, um, you know, the Genesis describes the earth as being in 6 days. Well, I think it offers more of a functional understanding rather than a material. Like, for example, create in me a clean heart, O Lord. I mean, nobody would imply that that's a material understanding. That would be a more functional understanding. Or the creation of Israel, that would be more of a functional understanding, implying that Israel could have already been, a desolated town until people, you know, or it could have been that they built the town with resources that were already there. So stone, wood, But, I think really when we're trying to explain to somebody our worldview who's really into science and biology and, astrophysics, we have to really reconsider um, the biblical literalism, because when we hold to that, it it really can become troublesome for other people who want to explore more of our worldview.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I have my scientific reasons for denying macroevolution. That being said, my basic view is, the Bible, especially the original Hebrew, the Christian worldview is big enough to encompass many different views on this, where whether it be the age of the Earth or theories of evolution, structuralism, and all these other things. And I don't necessarily think it should be a stumbling block for somebody who's not willing to give that up and they're just interested in Jesus. I think that's a good point. I think we should obviously have these discussions as Christians, but that it shouldn't be something we divide over. Something we should divide over is if someone says Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. Well, then they're not a Christian anymore. So Christian worldview, not really open to different interpretations on Jesus. Pretty open to, I think, would be different interpretations on origins. I don't think it's necessarily a fundamental issue depending on, the parts of it.
Yeah, or the Trinity as well, because I hold to the Trinity that God is three persons in one. I think that right there is a kind of a necessary or crucial belief.
Yeah, more important issue. And it's nice of you to say nice things about IP, but he's really not that special. He takes man's word over God, so that's not really something we put up with on this channel.
Origins of species over JMD had a really funny meme on that. It was like that Drake meme where there's the origins, there's the Bible. He was like, no, the origins of species. Like, yeah,
Yeah, I actually created that meme. I'm gonna ambush with IP with the next time he's on the channel. Hopefully he doesn't see this, so he's not prepared for it. So what would you say is your favorite apologetics book? Or actually, just favorite book. It doesn't even necessarily have to be an apologetics one.
My favorite apologetics books is probably going to be, I really enjoyed Cold Case Christianity. Now, I will give it a fair treatment. There was a part in there I didn't necessarily think I think that maybe he could have maybe rephrased it or rewrote it in a sense to where it wasn't like I understand that he was trying to be honest when saying that, well, it has to do with archaeological discoveries that cohere with the biblical account, how some people some scholars doubted the existence of Pontius Pilate until we found an inscription on stone. But he mentioned that there were other things that were kind of some people try to say that this custom wasn't being used back then, or this wasn't this guy maybe wasn't ruling back then, or just stuff like that in general that he mentions that we shouldn't consider those as troubling, because it's likely that they'll find an explanation for it later that coheres with the biblical account. I mean, I think he could have phrased it better, but at the same time, the fact that he was being honest about it, that's a good thing, because I consider honesty a virtue. Yeah. So I think that he did include that was not good or bad, should I say, but it's bad in some ways.
He ruined it. It negates the whole book. No, I'm just kidding. I'm picking on him because I've had him on the channel before.
Yeah, I saw, so on Amazon, there's this one guy who goes around he gives the God Delusion 5 stars, and he says good, informing, but then an apologetic book such as I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, Cold Case Christianity, or Mere Christianity, he gives a 1-star review and then makes a long rant, or types a long rant of why he thinks this guy is dumb and why this guy is wrong about some of his views. It's you could be a little more honest with your reviews. I don't think if an atheist is trying to be open, I wouldn't think he would just give all these books 1 stars. I think he would be giving them maybe a 3-star, at least, because seeing that comment, it's just really funny. It's just he'll review the God Delusion, like I said, and he'll give it a 5 stars. This guy's so brilliant, so informing, right. And then and even atheist Michael Ruse gave it a bad review. So, and then he reviews Cold Case Christianity and says, well, if he would have just applied his cold case, if he would have just used his cold case detective skills, he would have, came up with a different answer. And it's dude, you don't need to you don't need to make a long rant on why you shouldn't recommend this book to anybody, because nobody's really going to listen to you after they look at your like all of your other reviews compared to like the God Delusion, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, I as a Christian, I would give Bart Ehrman's books, for example, 5 stars because I think, obviously, I don't agree with him on a lot of stuff,
Like
but they're
misquoting Jesus. I
his books
mean,
are
I
brilliantly written.
think, hmm
But
yeah,
even if I was an
misquoting.
atheist, I would, especially Richard Dawkins' book. Holy cow, that's not even doesn't qualify as
Yeah, like his science books, you know, I think they're more informing. And misquoting Jesus, I think he makes a good point on textual criticism, you know. But when it comes to like the more like when they try to get involved in like when Richard Dawkins gets involved in God, it's just like okay, I think you just don't really know what you're talking about, Richard.
right. Well, when he himself says, and I don't necessarily want to go down this whole rabbit trail, but when he himself says, "Hey, this is the central argument of my book," and then the conclusion doesn't even follow from the premises, I'm like, okay, that's the best you got, okay, if you say so. Um, but I do have written down obstacles to faith. Were you specifically talking about your obstacles to faith, or you think obstacles in general? Or I'll let you expand on that.
Yeah. So obstacles to faith. You know, I always have doubts. I mean, that's just natural being a Christian. I mean, we're always going to have doubts, and you know that's why it's always good to give everything a fair treatment. Like you know, when it comes to reading books written by atheists, to give them a fair treatment. You know, like misquoting Jesus or, you know, maybe even the God delusion. Just always give it a fair treatment before we are just before we just put it down, set it aside, and say, "Nah, I'm not going to listen to him. I'm going to go with because we're all biased in a way. I mean, it's like and if somebody says, "Oh, I'm not biased," it's like you can test us. Like, okay, what's your favorite color? And they say, "Well, red." It's like, okay, you're biased towards red. I mean, but I think it's good to give everything evidence a fair treatment, and that's why I really fell in love with Inspiring Philosophy's channel. It's just his sources and his evidence rather than like Kent Hovind. I mean, yeah, Kent Hovind, he makes some good points. I won't deny that. But when it comes to like emotional arguments or like it's just I want to see some like data like IP's debate with Aaron Ra. I mean, like IP, including his debate with Vegan Gains and Matt Dillahunty. I mean, he just cited all these studies and meta-analysis that show that hey, religion is linked with positivity. But then Aaron, Matt, and Vegan, they all argued from like personal experience or
Yeah,
emotions,
and
and it
it was
was
all
just like,
anecdotal evidence.
yeah, it's like, hey man, we need to see some actual data. It's good that you're saying it's good. Like, okay, fair enough to say, well, this guy, I know this guy who's had a bad experience with religion. Okay, cool. But like, if I were an atheist, for example, and I was in a debate with a Christian, and I was trying to debate with him on why my views, like why atheism is, correlated with positivity. I would use studies to back it up. I wouldn't just use my personal experience. I would use studies to back that up.
Yeah.
And well, since I'm not an atheist, that's what I expect with atheists. Like, hey, if you're gonna be in a debate like that, in fact, Mike Jones is like he tweeted on Twitter um, about it was like Michael Shermer trying to say something like there are studies that show that people like atheism is correlated with or atheists are correlated with like positive thinking, and it's like he didn't cite any studies. Obviously, he just says the studies say this, and Mike Jones was like, hey, why don't we debate about this and go over these unnamed studies you so speak of. And that's when David Smalley came in. It's like, done. We'll see what the other Michael says. And so I really look forward to that debate. But, it's like everybody in general, not just, theists. It's just, you got to look at the evidence, what the evidence is saying, and we can't rely on like emotional or anecdotal evidence. I used to like anecdotal evidence. I thought it was effective, but, you got when you realize that it doesn't work in a debate, it's kind of useless.
Yeah. I will credit Matt Dillahunty. Matt Dillahunty at least was being more philosophically savvy and was like going after the studies and was like just asking
Hmm.
legitimate like philosophical questions about the studies and about their legitimacy and well, can we really draw these conclusions from this subset of data? So and I think at the end of the day, Michael just had a better understanding of the studies, which is why he won. But at least Matt was legit trying to just say talk about the studies instead of just saying, hey, here's all these anecdotal examples I know about that refute what you're saying. And it's funny as you're saying that, what came to my mind was Dennis Prager. I think people can find this on YouTube. Dennis Prager had Christopher Hitchens on his show. Obviously, this was a while ago. Um, but Christopher Hitchens' main thing is religious people do bad things, and that's why religion causes all these bad things. But then anytime Dennis Prager would cite an example of an atheist doing a bad thing, or look at all the evil that's been done in the name of atheism, Chris Hitchens would say, "Well, yeah, but you expect people to do that because that's what people are like. You can't really blame the ideas for it." And I'm like, double standard? Like, would you have any standards if you didn't have double standards? Like, okay, um, but
And people can justify, like, I would consider myself extrinsically religious. I have trouble saying that term, but like extrin extrin ex. I'll call it ex-religious people. How about that? Like
well, that makes it sounds like
extra
they're
religious.
former. There you go, extra.
Yeah, extra religious people, or I'll just say people who aren't devoted to like the beliefs but are involved in the
Right.
church. So these people, I mean, they'll try to you know they'll try to justify their claims, like for example, like not eating pork, or the law from the Old Testament that says, hey, we can do this. They'll try to use the Bible to justify it, but it's like you know there's it's never really the belief or the belief in God that causes these things. It's more for power. I don't think I think the studies are clear that it's not like a personal belief in God that causes these things. It's rather people can use the Bible to justify it, but rather it's they're trying to get power or money. In fact, J. Warner Wallace notes people will do these things in the name of money, power, sex. I mean, like I wouldn't just say that atheism causes people to be harmful. I would never. I don't think it does. I think that there are other factors that are involved in why people do these bad things. Like Hitler, I think that he I think that he was just wanting power, but it's not that because he was an atheist. It's he was wanting power. I just think he wanted to have power or some sort of control, and that's why he was slaughtering all these Jews.
Yeah, but yeah, an important thing to point out though is like, okay, let's say you have. Okay, well, let's just say yeah, he wanted power. Let's say it's not for a religious reason, but it's also not for an atheist reason, right? He's not saying in the name of atheism I want this power and I want to murder all these people. But the reality is if you have an atheistic worldview, then you don't have a moral authority telling you can't seek power at whatever means you deem necessary. So, at least with a flying spaghetti monster again telling us what to do, you have something above and beyond humanity that can give us a moral code. Um, Although I will say, John Dunphy, that scammer, uh, with his
Yeah,
YouTube channel
scam.
just kind of holding his cup out begging for money. He did make a knockdown argument in the comments. He said it's worse to be raised Catholic than to be abused by a priest. So I guess we should just pack it up and go home. But I have a couple more questions to ask you. So we're not going to pack it up and go home. Um, well, so you kind of mentioned before about obstacles to faith, and one of the ones you mentioned was bias. What would you say is maybe like the best way to overcome bias? Because my basic argument has just been just recognize you have it and then try to be as honest as you can.
Yeah, so this kind of what really makes me overcome these doubts is I would have to say my experience with God, because when I first became a Christian, which like when I first fully devoted myself to Christ, I actually wanted to have a personal conversation with God. Like I didn't want to just pray, like I wanted to hear. And the book that I read, it was called The Four Keys to Hearing God's Voice by Mark Verkler, and I think Mark Verkler is, amazing at explaining how, meditation. I think meditation is a good thing, and trying to focus on Christ, trying to focus on God to, get um, these thoughts that, spontaneous thoughts, which would be, coming from God. And I think the way that you can tell that they're coming from God is expectation. Like a lot of what the spontaneous thoughts I get are often like something I don't expect or an answer I don't expect. And then if it coheres with scripture, that's how I usually know it's from God. But whenever I ask God, like, hey, how can I overcome these doubts? He just, like, trust in me, keep focusing on me. And it's like, it kind of, it's I don't think it's like, I'll just put your blind faith in me. It's like, it's more of a, kind of, get rid of all that stress and just not worry about it and just continue looking at the evidence and, comparing it. I think that's a I think that's a good way to kind of overcome the doubts. Is just to kind of relax and meditate. Just don't let it get the best of you, really, and just continue exploring the truth. I think that's the best way to really overcome doubt.
Yeah, and I think I may be remembering it wrong. I think it was Ravi Zacharias who said, like, look, there's a difference between doubts and questions. Like, maybe you think you're having a doubt, but maybe it's just a legit question. And it's like
Yeah.
God can take the question. God's not offended by that or anything. Um, that's not a big deal. Um, so you mentioned before your favorite topic being theology. Do you have a favorite subtopic? Like within that,
So
because theology doesn't necessarily relate to apologetics. I mean, I think obviously the two are intertwined, but that's not necessarily the
mhm.
case.
So I really do enjoy. I'd say philosophy would be the primary, and then um, history slash science would be the secondary because I enjoy philosophy. I think it's a really should I say beautiful subject.
Objectively or
And
sub? No, I'm just kidding.
I think it's subjectively, but no, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But I also do like history and science because like history. I in fact I have a book coming tomorrow. It's The Annals by Tacitus, and I can't wait to read it. To learn more about ancient history. But I think learning about history is just what it does. It like takes you back. It's like a time machine. It just takes you back into like if you read books on like ancient civilizations, it's just really cool. Like Far Cry Primal is one of my favorite games now. And I need to get it back on my computer soon because Far Cry Primal was just like when I played it, it felt like a key to like 10,000 years ago, like 10,000 years before Christ. It was just like amazing what they were doing back then. They were hunting mammoths. They were into, they were still into like spirituality and stuff. It was just, whenever you read books on ancient history, it's just that wonderful key to the past. And it's like you get to be there as history's happen or as history's happening. And that's one of the reasons why I really like history. And then science, just really I'd say I don't really have a lot to talk about with science, but I am getting tomorrow. I'm also getting The Language of God by Francis Collins. Um, I think when you really get into the field of science, it's because that argument. Well, science disproves God. It's like you know, science is the study of patterns in nature. It's not like and God would be something outside of it. And that just seems kind of but not God. I mean, because God is beyond nature, and so that's one of the reasons why I like studying science is just really to kind of get more of an understanding of just the world around me.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Um, Next question. What is your favorite inspiring philosophy argument?
Oh, none of his arguments are good. And really, like, you can kind of tell that those guys like don't read any books on philosophy or anything like that. They just like, and it's like, do you even like read any philosophy books? Like, Have you read any Alvin Plantinga or, it's like you can't just assume you already know the ontological argument without learning about it first. And also process structuralism too of evolution. I really became attracted by that. Um, Even though I really still don't have much of an understanding of it, I need to read more about it. But I do think it's really effective in the realm of fine tuning, and it kind of just shows that hey, evolution isn't just complete randomness, but it's goal directed. Like everything else in nature is kind of goal directed. Evolution also is also goal directed. You
Yeah.
know, humans would have evolved, because it was supposed to happen. You know.
Well, so I do want to ask you about that, and we don't have to necessarily get into like a debate or anything about it. But because I'm not in favor of the theory of macroevolution, even when we talk about process structuralism, and the reason is because, and I would go with Stephen Meyer on this, and I know Stephen Meyer's more focused on taking apart Darwinism, not structuralism, and I know Mike has a problem with them not being distinguished properly. But one of the nails in the coffin for Darwinism was the discovery of epigenetic information. We didn't know about that. We thought there was just genetic information, and if you had mutations and random and natural selection, you could mutate the genetic information, get there. But with epigenetic information, you can't mutate that. You need new information infused to create new body plans, and natural processes don't do that. And so if we're going to say, well, but there's a view where at every new body plan, God is inserting new information, well, then that to me just becomes indistinguishable from special creation at that point. I mean, is this...
Yeah, and the Cambrian explosion was actually kind of, I would consider, problematic for evolution as well. Like specifically neo-Darwinism, because if we're starting out from just these little microorganisms and all of a sudden we're going up to bigger, a bigger organism, it's kind of like, well, where were those steps in between? I think that really is. I think that really is something special. It is problematic for evolution, and I'm trying to do. I've been trying to do research on it. It's just I'm not like I have a long list ahead of me of books to read, and like
Yeah.
the books on process structuralism is just kind of like it's kind of near the end there, and so like I probably won't even be reading about those books until when I get into college, like especially Stephen Jay Gould's book, Structure of Evolutionary Theory. It's 1,400 pages long, so I'll be busy. Yeah, in fact, last night I was trying to explain to somebody in a dream that this book's like 1,400 pages long. Imagine reading that in a couple of days. But I do stay open on these kind of things. Like if the reason why I'm really attracted by process structuralism, it's because it's really like I. I do consider myself biased towards it. I'm not gonna lie. I do have some biases, but that's why I'm getting into the research and stuff.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I didn't want to like try to force you into a corner of defending a view if you didn't feel
Oh
like
no,
confident doing it. One of the reasons I brought it up is well, because going back to what we said earlier, I do think the Christian worldview is big enough to encompass a disagreement or a difference on this issue. And the thing is like, if I were going to be a macroevolutionist, I would pick process structuralism. Because, even Dr. Josh Rasmussen talked about how he did like a virtual kind of simulating evolution in a computer program. And one of the things was that if you didn't specify a goal, it would just kind of, the life would just kind of replicate itself and then die out eventually. But if you specified a goal, then it would kind of unfold the way we would expect it. I'm just personally not convinced from the science that it did occur that way. But again, if you and I both believe in a God who's capable of creating life any way he wants, it's like we can have this discussion and we don't need to divide houses over it, so to speak. But maybe you've been talking about books. Maybe a final question. What do you think is like the best books for, say, beginners in apologetics would be?
So Cold Case Christianity would be a start. In fact, if I ever If I'm ever in that situation where I'm introducing apologetics, like my final response would be, "Hey, I want you to check out the book Cold Case Christianity because it was written by a former atheist who, in fact, was very anti-religious at the time, and then he looked at the evidence, and there you go. And I don't know if you can see mine up there, but it's
Yeah,
right
I
next
do.
to the
I do
big
see it.
one. Yeah, but I think it's a good starting book for and God's Crime Scene too. I need to read that too. And then also I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, because Frank Turek is one of the more prominent, apologists, and I think he's written some good books as well.
Yeah. And this one is particularly good. This is actually where I got an
Stealing from
introduction to
God.
epigenetic information. So, yeah, that's an excellent book too. Oh, sorry. So, do you have any final thoughts before we leave our viewers?
Um, I'd say um, a really good discussion too. Thank you for agreeing to do
Oh,
this.
absolutely.
And yeah, hopefully, if I can ever get in contact with IP, I can be on like an after show of one of his debates. But like, you know, I tried texting his, or I tried um, it's like on Messenger. I tried to text his Facebook page, but that may not be the best way to do it. I may have to like friend him on Facebook.
He's
But you know,
he's a busy man. He takes a long time to respond. He's too busy reading Origin of Species and taking that as more authoritative than the Bible. I do want to say last to make sure for everybody to go over to Teaching Theology. Was that the name?
yep, teaching
Teaching Theology
theology.
is the YouTube channel. Type that in. Go subscribe. Help Dylan out. Are there any other plugs?
I'd say that's it.
All right. Well, listen, I really appreciate you coming on the show, brother. We'll have to do it again sometime soon. Thanks.
Yep, yep. I'll see you.